I am going to begin this one at a window, on the first snowy night of the year, in a great quiet house in the North Country. Because it was at that window, watching the first snowfall, that two people who had signed a solemn contract to stay apart, discovered, both at once, and neither able to say it, that they had not the smallest intention of keeping to a single word of it. Let me set you gently down there, for this is a quiet story, and it wants a quiet telling. The house was Wildermere, an old rambling manor in a fold of the northern hills, and it was, that night, wrapped in the particular hush that comes over the world with the first real snow, that deep, soft silence when the whole loud, restless earth is muffled all at once beneath the white, and every sound is swallowed, and it seems, for a few hours, that there is nothing left alive but you and the falling snow and whoever happens to be standing beside you in the dark. And standing at the great window of the shadowed hall that night, unable to sleep, wrapped in a shawl over her nightgown, watching the flakes come spinning silent out of the black sky into the lamplight, was the mistress of Wildermere, a young woman of 26 named Frances, who was, by the strict and solemn terms of a contract she had signed some 8 months before, a married woman, and who had, by those same strict terms, absolutely no business feeling what she was feeling. For she was not alone at the window. She had come down in the dead of night, drawn by the strange silver light of the snow, thinking herself the only soul awake in the sleeping house, and had found, already there, standing at the same window watching the same snow, the man she had married. His name was Captain Gideon Blake, and he was her husband, and he was also, by the contract they had both signed with such cold satisfaction 8 months before, a man she was to have parted from within the year, having never once shared his name in anything but law, nor his roof in anything but arrangement, nor his room at all. That was the bargain. 1 year, and separate rooms. A marriage of pure convenience. A treaty between two wary strangers, each getting what they needed, and neither giving 1 inch of themselves. And they had signed it, both of them, certain to the bottom of their guarded hearts that it was exactly what they wanted. And now here they stood, at midnight, at a window, in the hush of the first snow, a husband and wife who were supposed to be strangers, and neither of them was watching the snow anymore. They were watching each other, in the silver dark, with the whole careful architecture of the contract standing between them like a wall of glass. And Frances Blake looked up at the grave, quiet man beside her, whom she had married for her land and sworn to release within the year, and found that 8 months of living beside him had done a thing to her that no contract in the world could undo. And she opened her mouth to say something, anything, some safe, ordinary thing about the snow, and found that she could not, because the safe, ordinary things had all deserted her, and the only thing left in her heart was the one thing she had signed a contract, promising never to feel. And I am going to stop us right there. Right there, at the window, in the snowlight, with two married strangers standing a breath apart, and the whole careful contract dissolving silently in the air between them like a snowflake on warm skin. Because before I tell you how these two came to be standing there, and what they did next, and why not 1 word of that contract was ever spoken between them again, from that night forward, you and I have our arrangement. Find the subscribe button and press it. It is free, and it takes a moment, and it means the next story finds you the instant I have it ready. And there is always a next, and they are always worth the having. And if you will not, then you owe me one, and I am very patient about my debts, and I never, ever forget. This is a tale about a bargain that 2 clever people made to protect their hearts, and about the snow that quietly melted it, and I promise you, it is worth every minute you spend by my fire. Now, before I let them turn from that window, I must take you back, some 8 months, to a cold spring and a colder contract, and show you how a fiercely independent woman and a proud guarded soldier came to marry for everything but love, and swear to stay strangers, and mean it. Come back with me. The snow will keep. It always does. It began, as a great many marriages of convenience begin, with a will and a threat. Frances Ashby, for that was her name before the contract made her a Blake, was the only child of old Mr. Ashby of Wildermere, a landowner of the old northern sort, and she had been raised, in the happy absence of any brother, as the heir to Wildermere in everything but law. Her father had loved her, and, being a wiser man than most, had seen early that his daughter had a genuine gift for the land, a real passion and a real talent for the running of an estate, and he had taught her all of it, and left her, at his side through her whole growing up, in charge of more and more of Wildermere, until by the time she was a grown woman, she ran the entire estate herself, and ran it beautifully, and loved every hedge and field and tenant of it with her whole fierce heart. Wildermere was not merely her home, it was herself, the thing she had made herself into, the work of her hands, the people she was responsible for and cared for and would have died for. There was not a tenant on the land whose name she did not know, not a child she had not held, not a trouble she had not helped to mend. Wildermere was hers, and she was Wildermere's, and she asked nothing more of life than to go on being so. And then her father died, in the winter, quietly, an old man at the end of a good life, and Frances discovered, to her horror, the one cruel flaw in the whole happy arrangement. For the law, in those days, did not love to let land come to a woman, and old Mr. Ashby, for all his wisdom, had been able to leave Wildermere to his daughter, only under a condition the lawyers had insisted upon to make the unusual bequest hold, that Frances must be married within 1 year of her father's death, and remain so. If she married within the year, Wildermere was hers, absolutely and forever. If she did not, if she remained a spinster past the 12-month, then the whole estate, house and land, and every soul upon it, passed instead to her nearest male relation. And her nearest male relation was her cousin, Mr. Lionel Ashby. I must tell you about cousin Lionel, briefly, for he is the shadow over this whole story. He was a grasping, cold, unpleasant man, deep in his own debts, who had looked upon Wildermere his whole life with the hungry eyes of a man calculating what he would do with it once it fell to him, which, as an unmarried woman's inheritance so often does, he fully expected it eventually would. And what he meant to do with it was simple: to sell it, or to squeeze it, to turn out the tenants Frances loved, and let the fields to the highest bidder, and wring every last penny from the land and the people her family had tended for 200 years. Frances knew it. Every soul at Wildermere knew it. If cousin Lionel got the estate, it was the end. The end of Wildermere as anything but a purse to be emptied, and the ruin of every family who depended on it. So Frances had 1 year to marry, or lose everything and everyone she loved. Now, you might think, well, she is handsome and clever and mistress of a fine estate. Let her simply marry, then surely there is no shortage of men. But here is where you must understand Frances Ashby, for it is the whole of her heart. She did not want to marry. She dreaded it more than she dreaded cousin Lionel, and she had a very particular and very good reason, which was this. In that age, when a woman married, she vanished. In the eyes of the law, a wife had no separate existence. Her property became her husband's, her income became her husband's, her very self was folded into his and disappeared. Frances had watched it happen. She had watched her own gentle mother, a bright girl once, diminished year by year into a shadow by a marriage, not a cruel one even, just an ordinary one, in which a whole person had been quietly erased into a wife. And Frances had sworn, watching, that she would never let it happen to her. She had made herself into someone, the mistress of Wildermere, competent and whole and free. And the thought of surrendering all of it, herself and her land and her hard-won independence, into the hands of some husband who would become, at a stroke, the legal owner of her whole existence, was more than she could bear. To save Wildermere, she must marry. But to marry, in the ordinary way, was to lose Wildermere, and herself, just as surely, only to a husband instead of to cousin Lionel. Unless she could find a very particular sort of husband and make a very particular sort of bargain. And that is exactly what Frances Ashby, being the clever, resourceful woman she was, set out to do. She would find a man who would marry her on her terms, a man who would agree, in a binding contract, to marry her in name only, purely to satisfy the will, to take an agreed settlement and lay no further claim to her fortune, or her land, or her person, to leave her entirely free to run Wildermere as she always had, and, at the end of a year, once the inheritance was secure beyond any challenge, to quietly agree to a separation, so that she might have her estate and her freedom both, and never truly be any man's property at all. She wanted, in short, a husband who would be no husband, a signature, a settlement, and a stranger, and nothing more. 1 year, separate rooms, a business arrangement to save her home without surrendering her soul. She needed a man honorable enough to keep such a bargain, and desperate enough to make it. And she found one, that cold spring, in Captain Gideon Blake. He was the last man in England who wanted to marry for money, which is precisely why he was the right one. Gideon Blake was a former army officer, a captain who had served long and hard through the late wars, and come home, when the peace came, to find the thing that so many good soldiers found: no war to fight, no place in the world, half pay, that was barely pay at all, and no fortune whatsoever. He was a proud man, and an honorable one. Honor was very nearly all he had, and he held to it the way a drowning man holds to a spar. And he had come home from the wars to a family in trouble, and no honorable means of helping them. For his father, lately dead, had been an unlucky, improvident gentleman who had left behind him nothing but debts and 3 unmarried daughters, Gideon's sisters, young women with no dowries and therefore no prospects, facing a future of dependence and genteel poverty and, very likely, no marriages at all, for the cruel truth of that age was that a girl without a dowry was a girl without a future. Gideon loved his sisters. He had come home meaning to save them, and he had discovered, to his despair, that there was simply no honorable way for a penniless half-pay captain to conjure the dowries that would give 3 girls a future. He had sold everything he could sell. He had sold his own commission. It was not enough. It came nowhere near enough. And then, through a discreet intermediary, came the strangest proposal of his life. A lady of independent estate, in need of a husband to satisfy a will, was seeking a gentleman who would marry her on strict and limited terms. A marriage of pure convenience, 1 year, separate establishments, no claim on her fortune beyond an agreed settlement. And that settlement, Gideon saw at once, was precisely, almost exactly, the sum he needed to dower his 3 sisters and secure their futures forever. It galled him. I want you to feel how it galled him, for it is the whole of his pride and the root of his own strict insistence on the terms. Gideon Blake despised fortune hunters, despised, above all things, the notion of a man selling himself in marriage for a woman's money. And here he was, being offered exactly that, and unable, for his sister's sake, to refuse it. His honor rebelled against every part of it. And so, and this is the thing that made him, in the end, the perfect man for Frances's bargain, Gideon made his own strict conditions in return, conditions born entirely of his wounded honor. He would take the settlement, yes, for his sister's sake, because he must, but he would take nothing else. He would lay no claim to Wildermere, nor to Frances's fortune, nor to Frances herself. He would be a husband in name only, absolutely. He would not touch her, would not presume upon her, would not for 1 instant behave as though he had bought a wife along with a signature. He would keep to his own room and his own affairs, ask nothing, take nothing, and at the year's end, release her entirely and go his way, so that no one, least of all himself, could ever say that Captain Gideon Blake had married a woman for her money and helped himself to her into the bargain. The separate rooms, the strict distance, the 1-year limit, these were not only Francis's protections, they were his honors. Protections too. She wanted the terms so as not to lose herself to a husband. He wanted the terms so as not to become the fortune hunter he despised. And so the two of them, coming at it from opposite directions and identical wariness, agreed on precisely the same cold arrangement, and were each privately relieved to find the other so insistent upon it. They met, before the wedding, exactly twice, both times to negotiate the contract, across a table, with lawyers present, like two nations agreeing a treaty. And I am told they rather respected each other, in that cold negotiating, each recognizing in the other a person of sense and pride and honor, each grateful that the other was not sentimental, or grasping, or foolish. But respect is not warmth, and there was no warmth in it, only two guarded, wary, self-protecting people, arranging to use each other for a year and then be free. They signed the contract with cold satisfaction. 1 year, separate rooms, an agreed settlement, no claim, no intimacy, no pretense of a real marriage, and a clean parting at the year's end. And then they married, a small cold ceremony, over in 20 minutes, and Captain Gideon Blake came to live at Wildermere, in a room at the far end of the house from his wife's, a stranger married to a stranger, both of them certain they knew exactly how the next year would go. They could not, my dears, have been more comprehensively wrong, but it took them a while to find it out. It began, as these things do, slowly. For the first weeks, they were exactly as cold and careful as they had contracted to be, and the great house of Wildermere held two married strangers who scarcely spoke. They kept to the terms with almost comical rigor. They took their meals together, because to do otherwise would have set the servants talking, but they ate in a stiff, formal, near silence, exchanging only the coolest civilities. They kept to their separate wings, their separate rooms, their separate lives. Francis went on running her estate exactly as before, and Gideon, scrupulously honoring his promise to lay no claim to Wildermere, kept entirely out of her business and occupied himself, a soldier with nothing to command and no war to fight, with long solitary rides and longer solitary hours, a restless, rootless, guarded man in a house that was not his and never would be. They were unfailingly polite, they were unfailingly distant, and each of them was privately, quietly relieved that the other was keeping so faithfully to the bargain, and told themselves that this cold, correct arrangement was exactly what they wanted, and would do very nicely for a year. But a house is a small place to share with a person, even a large house, even for two people determined to avoid each other, and living beside someone, day after day, has a way of teaching you things about them that no contract can prevent. And so, slowly, without either of them intending it, or even at first noticing it, Francis and Gideon began to learn each other. Francis noticed first, I think, the small things about her cold, correct husband that did not fit the picture of a man who had married her for money. She noticed that Captain Blake, on his long, solitary rides, had begun, without a word to her, asking no credit, to things about the estate that he mentioned once, diffidently, over their stiff dinner, that a wall in the north pasture was down, and a beast might stray, and that he had mended it himself before it did. She noticed that the servants, who were shrewd judges and had braced to dislike the stranger husband, had begun instead to warm to him, that the grooms spoke well of how he handled the horses, that the old steward had taken to seeking his advice, that the tenants' children had lost their fear of the grave, quiet captain and taken to following him about. She noticed that he was unfailingly gentle with the weak and the small, with the old and the young and the animals, and unfailingly hard only on himself. And she noticed, most of all, that beneath the cold, correct soldier, there was a deep and careful sadness, the shut-down grief of a man who had seen too much in the wars and come home to a world with no place for him, a man profoundly lonely, profoundly rootless, holding himself rigidly apart from a warmth he clearly hungered for and did not believe he had any right to. And Gideon, for his part, began to see the truth of the woman he had married. He had expected, half expected, in his wounded pride, a hard, grasping sort of woman, or a cold, managing one, and he found instead a woman of the most extraordinary warmth and competence, who ran her great estate, not with cold command, but with a fierce, loving care that took his breath away. He watched her with her tenants, watched her sit up all night with a sick child in a cottage, watched her forgive a struggling farmer's rent, watched her know and love every soul on her land, and he understood, slowly, that Wildermere was not merely property to Francis. It was her whole loving heart, made visible, spread out over 900 acres. He saw her competence and her courage and her fierce, guarded independence, and, because he was a perceptive man, he saw, too, the wound beneath it, the dread of being erased, the hard-won selfhood she was so terrified of surrendering, the loneliness of a woman who had made herself into a fortress because she had never met anyone she could trust not to conquer her. Two lonely, guarded, wounded people, each with a fortress heart, each learning, against all intention, that the stranger across the dinner table was not the thing they had feared, but something else entirely, something that called, quietly and dangerously, to exactly the loneliness each had spent so long defending. It could not stay cold. It began, over that long spring and into the summer, imperceptibly, to thaw. It thawed at the edges first, the way ice does, a word here, a moment there, small breaches in the careful distance that neither of them quite meant to make. It began, properly, with the estate, for they discovered, the two of them, that they were extraordinarily well matched at the one thing that mattered most to Francis. Gideon, the soldier, had a genius for organization, for logistics, for the management of men and resources that the army had honed to a fine edge, and Francis, the improver, had the deep knowledge of the land, and one evening, over some problem of the harvest, they fell, almost against their wills, into talking of it, really talking, and found their two minds meeting and sparking and building on each other in a way that delighted them both. Francis forgot, that evening, to be cold. Gideon forgot to be distant. They talked for 2 hours about drainage and rotation and the management of the home farm, and it was the happiest either of them had been in longer than they could remember. And when they realized at last how late it was and how warmly they had been speaking, they both drew back, flustered, and retreated behind their careful walls again. But the wall had a breach in it now, and they both knew it. After that, Gideon began, shyly, asking permission, honoring always his promise not to presume, to help. And Francis, who had run Wildermere alone, for years, and had sworn never to share the running of it with any man, found, to her own astonishment, that she wanted his help, that his soldier's mind lifted burdens from her she had not known were crushing her, that having a true partner in the work she loved was not, as she had always feared, a diminishment, but a doubling, that she was more herself with him beside her, not less. It confounded everything she had believed about marriage. She had thought a husband could only take. Here was a man who only gave, who asked nothing, claimed nothing, and made her stronger and freer, not weaker and smaller. It shook the very foundation of the fortress she had built. And Gideon, for his part, found something at Wildermere that he had not felt since before the wars, and had thought he would never feel again. He felt useful, and he felt, and, most dangerous of all, he began to feel that he belonged. The rootless, restless soldier, working the land beside his clever, fierce wife, welcomed by her people, needed and valued, and slowly drawn into the warm, loving life of the place, felt the old, shut-down grief in him, beginning, very quietly, to heal. He had come to Wildermere a hollow man, meaning only to endure a year and take his settlement and go. He found himself, instead, coming alive. And they laughed, that summer. That was the sign of it, the true sign. Two grave-guarded wounded people, who had signed a contract in cold silence, began. Over the estate, over the dinner table, over the small daily business of a shared life, to laugh together. Easily and often, the way people laugh who have found, unexpectedly, the one companion who understands them. And laughter, my dears, is the thaw. Once two people are truly laughing together, the ice is broken past mending, whatever contracts may say. They both felt it happening, and they both, being proud, guarded people terrified of their own hearts, said not one word about it. For Francis did not dare to hope that the cold, correct soldier who had married her for a settlement could ever come to want her. The woman, rather than merely tolerating her pleasantly for a year, and she was terrified, above all, of surrendering the fortress of her heart to a man who would, at the year's end, take his money and ride away exactly as they had agreed. And Gideon did not dare to hope that the fierce, independent woman who had married him to keep her freedom could ever want to be truly married to a penniless soldier who had, to his eternal shame, sold himself to her for money. He could not, in honor, presume upon her, could not risk becoming the fortune hunter he despised by pressing for more than he had contracted for. So each of them, falling in love, said nothing, hid it, guarded it, ached with it in silence, each certain the other did not, could not, feel the same, each holding faithfully to the cold terms of a contract that neither of them wanted anymore, and neither of them dared to break. And so it stood, two people desperately in love, and each convinced the love was one-sided, keeping rigidly to a bargain that had become a torment, saying nothing, when the first snow fell. Which brings us back, at last, to the window in the hushed hall on the first snowy night of the year, and the two of them standing a breath apart in the silver dark. She had come down unable to sleep, so had he. Neither had known the other was awake, and there is something about being discovered, alone and unguarded, in the deep secret hours of the night, that strips away the careful daytime armor and leaves two people standing before each other with nothing between them but the truth. They had stood a while in silence, watching the snow, and then Gideon, gazing out at the white world coming silently down, had said, low, almost to himself, the first entirely unguarded thing he had ever said to her. We used to dream of this, in Spain, in the heat, in the dust, in the worst of it. The men would talk of home, of an English winter, of the first snow, falling quiet on a field. It kept some of them alive, I think, the dreaming of it. A great many of them never saw it again. He was quiet a moment. I did not think I would ever stand at a warm window and watch the first snow fall and feel safe, at home. I did not think I would ever feel at home anywhere again. After the wars, I had rather given up on it. And Francis, standing beside him in the snowlight, heard the whole of his lonely, careful, grieving heart in those few words, heard the hollow man who had come alive at Wildermere without daring to say so, and something in her own guarded fortress heart simply gave way, all at once, like a wall of snow sliding off a roof. "And do you?" she asked, very softly. "Feel at home, here, now?" He turned from the window and looked at her, really looked at her, in the silver dark, with all the careful distance gone out of his face, and only the truth left in it. And he said, "Yes, God help me, Francis. Yes, more than I have ever felt at home anywhere in my life. Which is," his voice caught, "which is the one thing I had no right to let happen, and the one thing I could not prevent." And there it was, at last, in the open. The truth they had both been hiding, all through the long thawing year, hanging in the air between them, in the hush of the first snow. And Francis Blake looked up at her husband, and understood, in one breathless overturning instant, that he felt it too, that she had not been in love alone all these months, that the wall of glass between them was made of nothing but two people's fear, and that it had just, silently, shattered. She did not say, "I love you." Neither did he. That is the thing I most want you to understand about that night, for it is the tenderest thing in the whole tale. Neither of them said the words. Neither of them spoke one word about the contract, about the terms, about the year, about the separate rooms, about the bargain they were, in that moment, quietly and completely abandoning. There was no need. It was all there, understood, in the silver dark, in the way he looked at her, in the way she stepped, at last, across the small breadth of distance that the contract had put between them for 8 long months, in the way his arms came around her, as though they had been waiting to, since the day they signed the treaty that swore they never would. The snow fell silent outside the window, and 2 guarded, lonely, wounded people, who had contracted to stay strangers for a year and part, stopped being strangers entirely, without a single word, and let the whole cold architecture of the contract melt away into the hush, as quietly and as completely as the first snow melts into the warm ground. And from that night, this is the heart of the title, and the heart of the tale, neither of them ever mentioned the contract again, not once. The 1 year, the separate rooms, the agreed parting, the whole careful bargain that had brought them together, it simply ceased, from the night of the first snow, to exist between them, unspoken and unmourned. They did not discuss it, they did not renegotiate it, they did not tear it up in any grand scene. They simply, wordlessly, from that snowy night forward, stopped being the strangers it had made them, and started being the husband and wife it had sworn they would not be. And the contract, that cold document, was left to lie forgotten in some drawer, its terms dissolving of their own accord in the warmth of 2 people who had, at last, come home to each other. It was the most complete surrender either of them ever made, and the most joyful, and not a word was spoken. Some things, my dears, are truer for being left unsaid. But I am a storyteller, and you know by now that I will not let 2 people simply melt into their happiness without one last cold wind blowing through. And the cold wind, in this tale, was named Cousin Lionel. For the year was not yet up, and the inheritance was not yet finally, absolutely secure, and Cousin Lionel Ashby, watching from a distance with his hungry, calculating eyes, had not given up on Wildermere. He had been furious when Francis married in time to save it from him, but he was a grasping, clever, unpleasant man, and he had noticed something that gave him hope. He had noticed, for such men make it their business to notice, that Francis Ashby's marriage had all the marks of a sham, a sudden marriage to a penniless stranger, exactly in time to satisfy the will, separate rooms, as the servants' gossip confirmed, a cold arrangement that looked, to a suspicious eye, like precisely what it had been at the start, a fraud, a marriage of pure convenience, contracted for no reason but to cheat him, Lionel, of the inheritance that should have been his. And Cousin Lionel conceived a plan to break it, for here was his reasoning, and it was cunning. The will required Francis to marry, but the law, and Cousin Lionel's lawyers, could argue that a marriage meant a true marriage, a real union, and not a hollow legal fiction cooked up purely to defeat the will's intent. If Lionel could prove that Francis's marriage was a sham, that it had never been a true marriage at all, that the parties had never lived as man and wife, that it was a mere fraud contracted to cheat the rightful heir, then he might persuade a court to set it aside as a fraud upon the will, and claim Wildermere after all. And the great damning evidence of the sham, the thing that would prove it beyond doubt, was the very heart of the original contract, the separate rooms, the unconsummated marriage, the plain fact that Captain and Mrs. Blake had lived, all this while, as strangers under one roof, which the servants would confirm, and which would prove to any court that the marriage was a hollow fraud and no marriage at all. So Cousin Lionel brought his challenge. He engaged his lawyers, and gave notice that he meant to contest the inheritance, and set about, coldly, to prove that Francis's marriage was a sham designed to cheat him, gathering what evidence he could of the separate lives, the separate rooms, the cold arrangement, meaning to drag the whole thing before a court and break it. And here, my dears, is where the story turns beautifully upon itself, where the contract's cruelest term becomes, in the end, no threat at all. For cousin Lionel had built his whole challenge on a fact that had been true when the contract was signed, and had gathered his evidence of a sham marriage from the cold early months, and he had not reckoned on the first snow. He had not reckoned on the thaw. He came to break a marriage that was a hollow fraud between two strangers, and the marriage he came to break was, by the time he brought his challenge, no fraud at all, but the truest and warmest and most genuine marriage in the whole North Country. Two people, wholly and joyfully in love, living as man and wife in every sense there was. The sham had become real, and a real marriage cannot be broken by proving it a sham, for the simple reason that it is not one. When the challenge came, Francis was frightened, for the early evidence was real, and the will's condition was a genuine legal thread, and cousin Lionel was cunning and determined. But Gideon the soldier, who had faced far worse than a grasping cousin and a lawyer's letter, was not frightened at all. He was, in fact, magnificent. For the man who had come to Wildermere, a hollow, rootless stranger, meaning to take his settlement and go, had found there a home and a wife, and a whole loving world worth fighting for. And Captain Gideon Blake had spent his life fighting for things, and he knew exactly how to fight for this. He stood beside Francis, and he told her, with the quiet certainty of a man who has found the thing he will not lose, that cousin Lionel would not have Wildermere, would not break their marriage, would not take 1 acre nor 1 hour of the life they had built, because there was nothing to break. "He means to prove our marriage a fraud," Gideon said, and there was iron in it, and a spark of something almost like laughter. "Let him try. Let him bring his lawyers and his evidence of separate rooms. It was true once. It is true no longer, and it has not been true since the first snow, and I will stand up in any court in England and swear it, and so, I think, will you. For there is no marriage in this county more real than ours, whatever cold thing we signed a year ago. He has come to break a bargain. He will find, instead, a marriage, and there is no law on earth that lets a man break a true marriage merely because it began as something less. We will meet his challenge, Francis, and we will win it, because the truth is entirely on our side. The contract said 1 year and separate rooms, but you and I stopped keeping that contract months ago, and thank God we did, for it turns out to be the very thing that saves us. And they did win it, for the truth was on their side, and a happy true marriage, defended by 2 clever determined people who loved each other, was more than a match for a grasping cousin's cold scheme. They met cousin Lionel's challenge together, and they defeated it utterly. For when it came to the point, Lionel's whole case rested on proving the marriage a hollow sham, unconsummated and false, and he simply could not, because it was neither, and had not been since the first snow. Francis and Gideon stood up, side by side, as plainly and genuinely in love a married couple as any in England, and the servants who might once have testified to separate rooms testified now to a household transformed, a master and mistress devoted to each other, a marriage that had become the warm, beating heart of Wildermere, and Lionel's lawyers, seeing the truth of it, understood that they had no case at all, for you cannot prove a real thing false by pointing to what it used to be. The challenge collapsed. Cousin Lionel, defeated and furious, slunk back to his debts and his disappointment, and never troubled Wildermere again, and the inheritance was secured, absolutely and forever, beyond any possible challenge. Wildermere was Francis's, and the tenants she loved were safe, and the whole thing that the marriage had been contracted to save was saved. Which meant, of course, that the year was up. The contract was fulfilled. The inheritance was secure, and by the cold terms both of them had signed, so long ago, in another life, the moment had come when they were to part, when Captain Gideon Blake was to take his settlement and go his way, and Francis was to have her estate and her freedom, and the marriage of convenience was to be quietly dissolved, exactly as they had agreed. And here, at the very end, the words that had gone unspoken since the first snow finally had to be spoken, for the year's end forced the reckoning that the snow had let them avoid. They had never once discussed the contract since that snowy night, They had simply lived, joyfully, as man and wife, letting its terms dissolve unmentioned. But now the year was truly over, and the great unspoken thing had to be faced at last, and it was Gideon, the honorable man, who would not presume, who would not for the world trap a woman in a marriage she had contracted only for a year, who faced it, on a spring evening, near the anniversary of their cold wedding, with his heart in his throat. "The year is up, Francis," he said. "The inheritance is secure. Cousin Lionel is defeated. Everything the contract was meant to accomplish is accomplished. And so I have to say the thing neither of us has said since the snow, because I love you far too much to hold you to anything you do not freely choose." He took a breath, and it shook. "By our bargain, I am to take my settlement and go, and give you back your freedom, and let this marriage be dissolved. And if that is what you want, if the year was only ever the year, and the snow was only ever the snow, then I will do it, Francis. I will go, and I will bless you every day of my life, and I will never say one word to hold you. Your freedom was the whole of what you married me to keep, and I will not be the man who takes it from you at the last. So I am giving it back to you, here, plainly. You are free. The contract is fulfilled. You may send me away tomorrow with a clear conscience, and keep your Wildermere, and your independence, and every single thing you wanted, and I will go." His voice broke entirely. "But I have to tell you, before you choose, that I do not want to go, that I have not wanted to go since long before the first snow, that I came here a hollow man to take your money and leave, and I have found, instead, the only home and the only happiness I have ever known, and a wife I love past all sense or reason, and that if you asked me to stay, if you wanted me to stay, I would spend the whole of the rest of my life trying to deserve it. But it must be your free choice, Francis. The one thing I will not do is take your freedom. So choose, freely, with the year fulfilled and nothing binding you at all. Do you want me to go, or may I stay?" And Frances Ashby, Francis Blake, who had married to keep her freedom and dreaded above all things surrendering herself to a husband, looked at the man who had just handed her back her whole independence with both hands and asked her to choose in from perfect freedom, and understood, at last, the thing the whole snowy year had been teaching her, that the right love does not take your freedom, it is the thing you freely choose with it, that she was not more herself alone, she was most herself with him, that the fortress she had built to keep out any conquering husband had, in the end, simply opened its own gates, joyfully, to the one man who had never once tried to conquer it, and had only ever made her stronger and freer and more wholly herself than she had ever been. "You honorable, impossible man," she said, and she was laughing and crying at once. "You have just given me back everything I married you to protect, my freedom, my Wildermere, my whole self, and asked me to choose. Very well, I choose." She crossed to him and took his weathered soldier's face in her two hands, exactly as she had on the night of the first snow. "I choose you, Gideon, not for a year, for the whole of my life, not because a will requires it or a contract binds me, for nothing binds me now, and that is the whole point, but because I am free, entirely free, to choose anything in the world, and the thing I choose, freely and with my whole heart, is you. Stay, stay forever. Be my husband in truth, and my partner in everything, and never speak of that cold contract again as long as we live. For we tore it up on the night of the first snow, you and I, without a word, and I have never for one instant regretted it. I married a stranger to keep from losing myself, and I found, instead, the one person who ever made me wholly myself. Stay, my love. I am free, and I choose you, and I always will." And Captain Gideon Blake gathered his wife into his arms in the spring twilight, a whole year, and a first snow, and 100 unspoken truths behind them, and stayed, freely chosen and freely choosing, for the whole of the rest of their lives. And that, my dear listeners, is where I leave them. In a spring twilight at Wildermere, a soldier who found his home, and a woman who found that love and freedom were never enemies at all. The cold contract that had brought them together long since dissolved into the warm, true marriage it had never meant to make. They lived a long life at Wildermere, and a happy one, and they ran the great estate together, side by side, the improver and the soldier, and it thrived under their joint hands as it had never thrived before. And Frances Blake discovered, over the years, that she had lost none of herself in the marrying, but only doubled it, that the fierce, independent woman she had been so afraid to surrender was, in the partnership of a true equal, freer and stronger and more herself than she had ever been alone. Gideon's 3 sisters got their dowries from the settlement and made good marriages, and came often to Wildermere and loved their fierce, clever sister-in-law dearly. And the cold contract that had begun it all, the 1 year, the separate rooms, the agreed parting, was found, years later, forgotten in the back of a drawer, and Frances and Gideon read it over together and laughed until they wept at the 2 frightened, guarded strangers who had signed it, so certain they knew what the year would hold, and so gloriously, joyfully wrong. They kept it, that yellowing contract, ever after, not in shame, but in wonder, the record of the coldest bargain that ever melted into the warmest love, and a reminder, on the hardest days, of how very nearly they had let their own fear cheat them of the whole of their happiness. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the walls we build around our own hearts, and call them wisdom, and the quiet, patient, unspeakable something that melts them when we are not looking. Frances built her wall out of a fear of losing herself, and Gideon built his out of a wounded honor, and they signed a contract that was really just those 2 walls, drawn up in legal language and witnessed by lawyers. 1 year, separate rooms, keep apart, stay safe, surrender nothing. And they meant every word of it. And then they lived beside each other for a year, and worked beside each other, and laughed beside each other, and the walls came down anyway, not with a crash, not in a grand scene, but silently, the way the first snow falls, so gently that neither of them quite noticed the moment it happened, only that one night they were strangers keeping to a contract, and the next they were 2 people at a window in the snow who had, without a word, stopped being strangers forever. The best surrenders, I have always thought, are the ones we make in silence, to the person we did not mean to let in, and the truest contracts are the ones that no one ever signs. You have sat by my fire through a cold bargain and a long thaw and a first snow that melted a whole year's careful distance, and I will not pretend I could have told it without you at the other end of the line. If it has given you something tonight, a warmth, a tenderness, a quiet hope that the walls around your own heart might yet come down for the right and gentle soul, then I would ask you, before you go, to subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, for there are a great many more of these, and every one has a heart, and I should hate for you to miss a single one. It costs you nothing, and it means more to me than I can say from this side of the fire, and if you still will not, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me one. You have owed me since the first snow fell on a quiet window. I am patient, and I never forget a debt, though I promise you, I shall never make you sign a contract about it. Subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, and come back to me beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every love is hard won, and every ending is deserved. Good night, and if ever you should find yourself keeping careful, sensible distance from someone your heart has quietly decided otherwise about, do watch the sky, won't you, for the first snow. It has a way of melting all our best-laid bargains, and it is very often right.